Rear Admiral Claire Reynolds, ma'am. The words cracked through the ballroom like a rifle shot. For a second, no one moved. The crystal chandeliers above us shimmered softly, casting warm golden light across the Norfolk Yacht Club ballroom. But suddenly the whole room felt cold enough to freeze breath. Lieutenant Commander Ethan Brooks stood ramrod straight at attention beside his chair, his face pale with shock. And then, in front of 200 wedding guests, retired officers, neighbors, family friends, half the military old guard of coastal Virginia, he raised his hand in a sharp, formal salute. To me. The same people who'd been laughing only seconds before now stared in stunned silence. My father's champagne glass slipped from his fingers and shattered across the marble floor. That was the moment everything changed. An hour earlier, the room had been filled with the kind of cheerful noise people make when they believe they're witnessing a perfect American family celebration. Silverware clinked. Soft jazz drifted from the quartet near the dance floor. Waiters moved between tables carrying crab cakes and bourbon-glazed filet mignon. Outside the windows, the Elizabeth River reflected the last pink light of a Virginia sunset. It should have been one of the happiest nights of my life. I was 34 years old, standing in a quiet ivory wedding gown, beside the man I loved, preparing to begin a new chapter. Instead, I stood there feeling 12 years old again. Small. Invisible. Waiting for my father's approval. Colonel James Reynolds, retired United States Marine Corps, had spent his entire life commanding rooms. Even at 71, his posture was straight enough to shame cadets half his age. His silver hair was cut regulation short, and his voice still carried the sharp authority that had once made grown men snap to attention. To the world, he was a decorated war hero. To me, he was the man who had spent my life reminding me I would never measure up. That honor belonged to my older sister, Vanessa. Vanessa was polished perfection, beautiful, outgoing, socially effortless. The kind of woman who could glide into a room and instantly become its center. Father adored her. Always had. He called her his true legacy. I was the quiet one. Too serious. Too private. Too focused on things he never considered glamorous enough to matter. And tonight, apparently, I was still a disappointment. He stood at the head table, smiling broadly as he raised his champagne glass. My youngest daughter, Claire, he announced, his voice warm with the kind of false affection that always made my stomach tighten. A few guests turned politely toward me. I forced a smile. Then his expression shifted. That familiar, amused smirk. The one that meant pain was coming. Well, he said, chuckling, I suppose every family has one child who peeks at checking IDs at the gate. Scattered laughter rose instantly. The kind people offer powerful men because they think they're supposed to. My fingers tightened around my bouquet. Father continued. Claire's just a gate guard down at Naval Station Norfolk. Never aimed very high, I guess. More laughter. Vanessa covered her smile with her napkin, pretending embarrassment. Her husband leaned close and whispered something that made her grin wider. Across the table, my fiancé Daniel stiffened beside me. He started to rise. I touched his arm gently. Don't. He looked at me, his eyes burning with anger, but slowly sat back down. My mother had taught me something long before cancer took her 11 years ago. Never wrestle for dignity. If it belongs to you, silence will protect it until truth arrives. I could still hear her voice as clearly as if she were standing beside me. That memory steadied me. Father lifted his glass higher. Now, he said, his smile broadening, let me show you what real military excellence looks like. He turned toward the guest seated 2 chairs away. Lieutenant Commander Ethan Brooks, Father's prized protégé. A Navy SEAL officer he'd spent the last 3 years bragging about to anyone who would listen. If Father ever had a son, he'd once said he'd want him to turn out like Ethan. Ethan stood politely as the room applauded. Tall and athletic, his dark dress uniform immaculate, his face carrying that calm confidence military command tends to carve into a man after enough years. Father beamed. This, he announced proudly, clapping Ethan's shoulder, is one of America's elite Navy SEALs, a man who's actually done something with his life. The applause grew louder. Then Ethan looked at me, and everything changed. At first, confusion crossed his face, then disbelief, then horror. His eyes widened as recognition slammed into him. I knew that look. I'd seen it before. Usually moments before very competent officers realized they'd unknowingly walked into a classified briefing chaired by someone they had grossly underestimated. My lips twitched despite myself. Oh no. He knows exactly who I am. Father noticed Ethan's stare and laughed. Careful, son. Don't let my daughter intimidate you with her gatehouse authority. The room chuckled again. But Ethan didn't laugh. He looked physically ill. His face drained of color. His shoulders locked. And then slowly he pushed his chair back. The scrape of wood against polished floor echoed unnaturally loud in the ballroom. Conversation stopped. Every head turned. Ethan stepped around the table, his polished shoes clicking against marble as he moved directly toward me. My father frowned. Ethan. But Ethan ignored him. He stopped 3 feet in front of me. His spine snapped rigid. His right hand rose sharply to his brow, and in a voice clear enough to shake every person in that room to their core, he said, Rear Admiral Claire Reynolds, Commander Naval Special Warfare Strategic Operations Division. Permission to speak freely, ma'am. The silence that followed felt eternal. And then my father dropped his glass. The sound of breaking crystal seemed to echo forever. My father stared at the shattered remains of his champagne glass, as if it had betrayed him personally. No one moved. No one spoke. Even the quartet had gone silent. The violinist still held her bow suspended over the strings, frozen halfway through what had been a soft rendition of Unforgettable. I looked at Ethan Brooks still standing before me in full salute. His expression was composed, but I could see the tension beneath it. He was a seasoned officer. He'd stood in active combat zones with less visible discomfort than he felt right now. I understood why. This was not merely awkward. This was catastrophic. He had just publicly exposed something that had remained deliberately hidden for over 6 years. And in doing so, he had shattered the illusion my father had built his pride around. I held his gaze for another moment, then gave the slightest nod. At ease, Commander. His hand dropped instantly. A collective intake of breath moved through the ballroom. My father blinked rapidly. His weathered face had gone pale beneath the warm chandelier light. What the hell is this? He demanded. No one answered. He looked from Ethan to me, searching for the punchline. Vanessa leaned forward, forcing an uneasy laugh. Okay, she said brightly, her voice strained. This is funny, really funny. Claire hired an actor. No one joined her laughter. Her smile faltered. Ethan turned slowly toward my father. The shift in his posture was subtle but unmistakable. Respect remained, but now it carried military precision instead of social courtesy. Sir, he said evenly, Rear Admiral Reynolds is exactly who I addressed. My father let out a sharp bark of disbelief. That's absurd. It is not, sir. The calm certainty in Ethan's voice struck the room harder than shouting ever could. Father's jaw tightened. She works gate security at Naval Station Norfolk. Ethan hesitated. For the first time, he glanced at me for permission. I gave him another small nod. He faced my father again. Sir Rear Admiral Reynolds oversees Naval Special Warfare Strategic Operations Intelligence Coordination for Atlantic Command. The room erupted into whispers. A woman near the back gasped audibly. Someone muttered, That's a 3-star billet. Another whispered, She's too young. I'd heard that one before. Too young. Too quiet. Too female. Too private. Too much of something for people who had never learned to recognize substance unless it announced itself loudly. My father laughed again, but this time there was no confidence in it. No, he said. No, absolutely not. Ethan's expression remained steady. Yes, sir. Father shook his head sharply as if trying to physically reject reality. She would have told us. I felt every eye in the room swing toward me. The silence pressed in. For a moment I thought of my mother. I saw her exactly as she'd looked during one of our last conversations, thin from treatment, sitting by the hospital window, while rain traced silver paths down the glass. Claire, she'd said softly, some truths ripened slowly. Let them. So I spoke calmly. My work required confidentiality. Father's eyes widened. You're saying all these years? Yes. You let us believe? Yes. His face flushed deep red. You embarrassed this family deliberately. There it was. Not confusion. Not hurt. Not concern. Humiliation. That was what wounded him most. I almost pitied him for it. Almost. Daniel stepped closer beside me, his hand resting gently against the small of my back. His steady warmth grounded me. He had known the truth from the day we became engaged. Naval intelligence had vetted him thoroughly before I could tell him. He had never once looked impressed. Only proud. That difference mattered. Vanessa suddenly stood. "This is insane," she snapped. Claire barely graduated high school without crying every week. A few uncomfortable guests shifted in their seats. I looked at her quietly. "I graduated first in my class at Annapolis." Her face emptied. I continued. "Masters from the Naval Postgraduate School, Strategic Distinction Honors." The words landed like stones dropped into still water. Ripples of stunned silence spread outward. Vanessa sat down hard. For years she had rewritten our childhood aloud so often that even she had come to believe her version. The weak little sister. The forgettable one. The family embarrassment. It had always been easier for them to preserve that fiction than confront what I'd actually become. Ethan cleared his throat. "There's more, sir." Father looked like a man approaching a firing squad. Ethan spoke carefully. 6 years ago during Operation Silent Harbor, Admiral Reynolds made a command decision that saved 23 operators, including my team. A murmur swept the room. She identified an intelligence compromise 3 minutes before extraction. If she hadn't countermanded launch authorization, every man in our unit would have died. He paused. Then he looked directly at my father. "I'm alive because of your daughter." The room fell utterly still. My father's lips parted, but no sound came out. I had never intended this moment. That was the truth no one here understood. I had not hidden my career for revenge. I had hidden it because secrecy was part of service. And because some small wounded part of me had still hoped that one day my father might value me without needing medals to prove I deserved it. That hope had died quietly years ago. Still watching him unravel hurt more than I expected. His shoulders sagged. For the first time in my life, Colonel James Reynolds looked old. Not commanding. Not powerful. Just tired. And lost. His eyes found mine. There was confusion there. And beneath it something far more painful. Regret. He opened his mouth but no words came. Then he turned abruptly and walked away from the head table. No explanation. No command. No dignity. He simply walked through the stunned guests across the ballroom and disappeared into the dark hallway beyond the reception doors. No one moved to follow him. No one dared. The room remained suspended in stunned silence. Then Ethan looked back at me, his expression deeply apologetic. "I'm sorry, ma'am." I offered him a faint smile. "You followed protocol, Commander." "Yes, ma'am." Daniel leaned close. "You okay?" I looked toward the empty doorway where my father had vanished. For a long moment I said nothing. Then I answered honestly. "No. But I think this is where the truth finally begins." And somewhere deep inside I could almost hear my mother's voice again. Soft. Certain. Patient as ever. Now he'll see. For several long seconds after my father disappeared through the ballroom doors, no one knew what to do. It was almost surreal. 200 people sat frozen beneath glittering chandeliers, while the string quartet remained motionless on the small raised platform bows, still hovering over strings, as if even music had lost permission to continue. Then the whispers began. They rose gradually like wind moving through dry leaves. Soft at first, then louder. Questions, speculation, disbelief. I had spent most of my adult life controlling chaos in classified operations centers, where one wrong word could cost lives. And yet, standing in that ballroom hearing my own family's world collapse around me, I felt strangely powerless. Daniel squeezed my hand. His touch was steady, warm grounding. "You don't have to stay for this," he said quietly. I looked at him and managed a small smile. That was one of the reasons I loved him. He never tried to solve my pain for me. He simply stood beside me while I faced it. "I do," I said. He nodded. Across the room, Vanessa was still sitting stiffly in her chair, her face drained of color. Her husband Richard leaned close, speaking urgently into her ear, but she barely seemed to hear him. For perhaps the first time in her life, she had no social script prepared for this kind of humiliation. She had always thrived in certainty, and tonight certainty had abandoned her. Ethan remained standing near the head table, visibly uncomfortable. I stepped toward him. At ease, Commander. His posture softened slightly. I owe you an apology, ma'am. You followed protocol. I still should have anticipated operational discretion. I almost smiled. Only Ethan would apologize for showing too much respect. It's fine, I said. He hesitated, then lowered his voice. Your father doesn't understand what he's dealing with. No, I said quietly. He never did. Ethan looked as though he wanted to say more, but years of discipline kept him silent. He gave a respectful nod and stepped back. That was when Vanessa finally stood. Her heels clicked sharply across the marble as she approached me each step, carrying the kind of rigid fury she had perfected since childhood whenever reality failed to flatter her. This is unbelievable, she hissed. Her voice was low enough to avoid public spectacle, but venomous enough to cut. You let this happen. I studied her face. Even now she looked less hurt than inconvenienced. As if my existence had violated some private agreement she believed the universe owed her. I didn't do anything, I said calmly. You humiliated Dad. The words were so absurd I nearly laughed. For 60 years my father had humiliated himself with his own pride. Tonight merely removed the curtain. Vanessa's eyes flashed. You always were jealous. There it was. The oldest lie in our family. The one she had repeated so often she no longer questioned it. Claire envie Vanessa. Claire resents attention. Claire wants what Vanessa has. It had never once occurred to her that I might simply want peace. I looked at her steadily. No, Vanessa. Her expression faltered. It was the first time I had ever said those words to her plainly. No explanation. No apology. Just truth. And truth, when spoken, simply has a way of sounding louder than shouting. Her face hardened. Before she could answer, my Uncle Harold approached. Harold was my mother's older brother, a retired high school principal from Richmond, practical kind, impossible to impress. He looked from Vanessa to me and said gently, Claire, your father's in the library. I nodded. Vanessa immediately stepped forward. I'll talk to him. Harold blocked her path without effort. No, he said. Something in his tone stopped her cold. Then he turned to me. He asked for you. A strange heaviness settled in my chest. My father had not asked for me, not truly, not personally, in years. Not unless it involved obligation. Duty. Appearances. This felt different. I looked at Daniel. He gave me the smallest encouraging nod. I'll be here. I touched his cheek briefly, then turned toward the hallway. The library sat at the far end of the club, paneled in dark walnut and lined with old naval histories no one actually read anymore. As I approached, I could see warm yellow light spilling beneath the half-open door. I stepped inside quietly. My father stood by the tall windows overlooking the river. His back was to me. He looked smaller somehow. Not physically. Spiritually. Like a monument after the bronze has begun to crack. For several moments neither of us spoke. Then he said without turning around, How long? His voice sounded older than I had ever heard it. 6 years at flag rank, I answered. He was silent. Then, and before that, Special Operations Command assignments, Annapolis before that. A dry laugh escaped him. Not amused. Broken. All those years. Yes. He finally turned. I barely recognized his face. The confidence was gone. In its place was naked confusion. Why didn't you tell me? The question should have angered me. Instead, it made me tired. I thought carefully before answering. Would it have mattered? He flinched. The truth struck harder than accusation ever could. His mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. Finally, he said, of course. I held his gaze. No, Dad, it wouldn't have. He looked away. And for the first time in my life, Colonel James Reynolds had no defense. No command voice. No righteous lecture. Nothing. Just silence. Then unexpectedly his face twisted with something raw and desperate. I gave my whole life to service, he said hoarsely. Everything I had, every sacrifice, every damn year. I know. His eyes lifted sharply. "Do you—" There was no accusation in it. Only pain. And suddenly I understood something I had never fully seen before. This wasn't just pride. This was grief. The grief of a man who had built his identity around military honor because he had nothing else to anchor himself to. And now he had discovered his own daughter had surpassed everything he ever achieved. Not because she wanted to shame him, but because life had simply unfolded that way. It had shattered him. He sank heavily into one of the leather chairs near the fireplace. For a moment he looked less like my father and more like an exhausted old Marine who had finally run out of battles to fight. Then he whispered the words I never thought I'd hear. "I failed you." And for reasons I couldn't explain, hearing him say it hurt far more than all the years he hadn't. My father sat motionless in the leather chair, staring into the empty fireplace, as though flames might suddenly appear and burn away everything he had become. The words still hung between us. "I failed you." All my life I had imagined hearing him say something like that. As a little girl, I used to lie awake in my bedroom beneath the soft Virginia rain and picture him coming to my door. He would sit on the edge of my bed, his stern face finally softened by understanding, and he would tell me he'd been wrong. He would tell me he saw me. He would tell me he was proud. Children build entire futures around impossible hopes. And when those hopes never arrive, something inside them quietly learns how to survive without them. Standing there in that dim library, I realized I no longer needed those words. And somehow that made hearing them even sadder. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Then my father reached slowly into the inner pocket of his dress jacket. His hand trembled. That alone startled me more than anything else tonight. Colonel James Reynolds did not tremble. Not when he buried his wife. Not when he lowered friends into Arlington Earth. Not when cancer hollowed our home room by room until my mother's laughter became memory. But now his fingers shook as he withdrew a single envelope. The paper was yellowed with age, the edges soft from handling. My breath caught instantly. I knew that handwriting. Elegant and deliberate. My mother's. He held it out to me. "She wrote this before she died," he said quietly. I stared at it without moving. My mother had been gone 11 years, and somehow this letter had remained hidden all this time. "She made me promise not to give it to you unless—" He swallowed hard. "Unless I finally understood what she was trying to tell me." I looked at him sharply. His face crumpled with shame. I didn't understand until tonight. Slowly I took the letter. The paper felt impossibly fragile beneath my fingers. For a moment I couldn't open it. Just touching something she had once held made grief rise fresh and sharp in my chest, as if no time had passed at all. I sat across from my father and carefully unfolded it. The familiar loops of her handwriting blurred instantly through tears. I blinked hard and began to read. "My dearest Claire, if you are reading this, then your father has finally learned what I prayed he would understand while I was still here. You were never meant to live loudly, you were meant to live deeply." A tear slipped down my cheek. I kept reading. "Your father believes strength must be announced to be real. He learned that from generations of men who were never taught how to listen quietly enough to recognize gentleness as power. But I have watched you since the day you were born, and I know the truth of you. You do not need applause to become extraordinary. You never did." My vision blurred completely now. I wiped my face and continued. "One day your silence will accomplish what noise never could. And when that day comes, I hope your father will finally see that honor is not measured by rank praise or appearances. It is measured by character when no one is watching." I stopped. The room was silent except for the soft hum of distant reception music drifting faintly through the walls. My mother had written the words nearly a decade before I made Rear Admiral. Before Operation Silent Harbor. Before any of it. And yet she had known. Somehow she had always known exactly who I was becoming. I looked up slowly. My father's face was wet with tears. I had seen my father cry only once before at my mother's funeral. Even then he had hidden it quickly as if grief itself were some private tactical weakness. Tonight he made no effort to hide. "She tried to tell me," he said hoarsely. I said nothing. He shook his head slowly, his eyes hollow with regret. I thought Vanessa was everything success was supposed to look like. Charm, ease, recognition. His voice cracked. And Claire, every time I looked at you, I saw all the things I didn't understand. He rubbed both hands over his face. You were quiet, reserved, always watching, thinking. A painful smile flickered. You reminded me of her. The truth of that struck me hard. My mother had been exactly that way, gentle, thoughtful, deeply observant. And my father had loved her fiercely. But perhaps he had never fully understood her either. She saw through me, he whispered. Your mother knew I built my whole life chasing rank because I was terrified of being ordinary. His voice broke completely now. I thought if I became important enough, accomplished enough, respected enough, then maybe I'd finally feel like I mattered. The confession was so naked, so painfully human that my anger began to loosen around its edges. For years I had imagined my father as cruel because cruelty was simple to understand. This was harder. This was a wounded man who had mistaken status for worth and spent decades teaching himself that love must be earned through achievement. And because he believed it for himself, he had imposed it on his daughters. Vanessa learned to perform. I learned to disappear. Neither of us escaped unchanged. He looked at me, then his expression utterly defenseless. I was jealous of you. The words stunned me. You moved through the world with certainty I never had, he said. Even as a little girl, quiet certainty. You didn't need applause. A weak laugh escaped him. You already had what I spent 70 years chasing. The room fell still again. And in that silence I felt something shift inside me. Not forgiveness. Not yet. But understanding. And sometimes understanding is the first honest step toward mercy. He lowered his head. I don't know how to fix what I broke. I looked down at my mother's letter in my hands. Then back at the man before me. For the first time in my life, my father was not asking for admiration. He was asking for grace. And I finally understood what my mother had wanted me to see. Broken people often wound others not because they lack love, but because they have never learned how to give it. I folded the letter carefully and stood. Then I walked to him and placed my hand gently on his shoulder. He looked up at me with the bewildered expression of a man receiving kindness he does not believe he deserves. And softly, for the first time in decades, I said, "Come back to the reception, Dad. We still have a wedding to finish." His breath caught. And slowly, trembling visibly now, he nodded. For a long moment my father didn't move. He simply sat there staring up at me as if he couldn't quite believe the hand resting on his shoulder was real. Then slowly he placed his weathered hand over mine. His palm was rough and familiar, marked by age and decades of military life. It was the same hand that had once steadied the handlebars when I learned to ride a bicycle. The same hand that had pinned Vanessa's high school honors medal to her dress while I stood unnoticed in the background. And now it trembled like a frightened child's. "I don't deserve this," he whispered. His voice cracked so deeply it barely sounded like him. "No," I said gently, "maybe not." He flinched. Then I squeezed his shoulder and continued. "But grace isn't about deserving." The words weren't entirely mine. They were my mother's. I had heard her say them more times than I could count, to frightened church members, grieving neighbors, even once to a cashier who'd broken down after losing her husband. Grace was the language my mother spoke most fluently. And standing there in that library, I realized she had left enough of it in me to carry forward. My father lowered his head and gave the smallest nod. Then he stood. For a second he swayed slightly, and I instinctively steadied him. He looked at me with quiet astonishment. When I was little, he had always been the one holding me upright. Time had reversed us. There was something strangely holy in that. Together we walked back down the long paneled hallway toward the ballroom. The closer we came, the louder the sounds of reception life returned. Soft conversation, silverware clinking, the faint tuning of violin strings, as the quartet prepared to resume. When we reached the double doors, my father hesitated. Fear crossed his face. Real fear. Not of combat or failure, but of judgment, of humility. For a man who had spent his life commanding respect, there was no battlefield more difficult than apology. I met his eyes. "You can do this." He studied me for a second, then gave a slow nod. And together we stepped inside. The room fell silent instantly. 200 faces turned toward us. But this silence felt different from before. Not stunned. Expectant. The kind of stillness people offer when they sense something honest is about to happen. My father walked slowly to the center of the ballroom. For the first time in my memory, Colonel James Reynolds looked neither proud nor polished. He looked human. He turned to the guests and cleared his throat. When he spoke, his voice was steady but stripped of performance. "Ladies and gentlemen, I owe my daughter an apology." The words landed heavily. No one moved. He turned toward me fully. And there, in front of every officer, neighbor, family member, and old friend who had ever accepted his version of our story, my father said, "Claire, I spent most of my life teaching men how to serve with honor." His voice shook. And somehow I failed to honor my own child. Tears blurred my vision instantly. Not because I had needed these words, but because I knew how much they cost him. He swallowed hard. I judged worth by appearance, rank, recognition. His eyes shone openly now. And while I was busy admiring noise, my daughter was quietly becoming the finest officer I've ever known. A quiet gasp moved through the room. Vanessa lowered her eyes. Even she could not look away from truth anymore. My father took one slow breath. Then, before anyone could react, he did something no one expected. He came to rigid attention. And he saluted me. Not as father to daughter, not as a social gesture, but as one officer rendering full military respect to another. The ballroom stood frozen. My throat tightened so sharply I could barely breathe. Then instinct and something deeper than instinct rose within me. I returned the salute. Perfectly. For one suspended moment, the years between us seemed to dissolve. Not erased. Not forgotten. Simply acknowledged. And honored. When our hands lowered, the room erupted into applause. Not loud or theatrical. Warm. Steady. Real. Daniel was suddenly there beside me, his eyes bright with tears he made no effort to hide. "You ready to get married, Admiral?" he asked softly. I laughed through my tears. "Yes," I whispered. The ceremony resumed simply after that. No spectacle. No pretended perfection. Just truth. And perhaps because of that, it became more beautiful than I had ever imagined. As I stood beside Daniel beneath the soft glow of chandeliers and spoke vows I meant with my whole heart, I felt my mother's presence as surely as if she stood among us. Not in grief. In peace. Later, after the final dance and the last toast, I stepped alone onto the terrace overlooking the dark water. The Elizabeth River shimmered beneath moonlight, calm and endless. Behind me, I heard footsteps. My father. He stopped beside me, hands folded quietly behind his back. For a while, neither of us spoke. Then he said, "Your mother would have been proud tonight." I smiled softly. "Yes." He looked out over the water and nodded. Then, almost too quietly to hear, he said, "So am I." For years, those were the words I thought I needed most. But hearing them now, they felt less like victory and more like closure. A gift arriving exactly when it was finally safe to receive. As dawn began to pale the eastern horizon, I thought of what my mother had written. Character is what remains when no one is watching. Titles fade. Applause fades. Even pain fades if we let grace do its work. But character endures. And sometimes life gives us the chance to become the kind of people who can forgive what once broke us.